the nasal septum. The cartilage of the septum is somewhat quadrilateral. It's a quadrilateral septum, thicker at its margins than at its center, and completes the separation between the nasal cavities in front. The septum of the nose is made up of a cartilaginous and bony component. In front is the cartilage, behind is the bone. The bony components comprise of two parts, the perpendicular plate of ethmoid and the vomer. The anterior margin of the cartilaginous septum, thickest above, is connected with the nasal bones and is continuous with the anterior margin of the lateral cartilages. Below, it is connected to the medial crurae of the greater ala cartilages by fibrous tissue. Its posterior margin of the cartilaginous septum is connected with the perpendicular plate of ethmoid and its inferior margin with the vomer and the palatine processes of the maxilla. Now, the cartilaginous part of the nasal septum may be prolonged backwards as a narrow process, and this is called the sphenoidal process for some distance between the vomer and the perpendicular plate of ethmoid. The septal cartilage does not reach as far as the lowest part of the nasal septum, and this is formed by the medial crurae of the greater ala cartilages and by skin. Now, this part is freely mobile and therefore called the septum mobile nasi. This is the lowest part of the cartilaginous part of the nasal septum, and it is connected to the medial crurae of the greater ala cartilage, and that connection is by fibrous tissue. The lower lateral cartilage has a medial and a lateral crurae. The two crurae join together to form the columella, and the two crurae are joined by the ligament of Pittangi, and to this is inserted the lowest part of the cartilaginous part of the nasal septum. The bony components. The posterior part of the nasal septum comprises of two major bony components, the perpendicular plate of ethmoid and the vomer. Now, it has also got contributions, number one, from the sphenoidal crest and the rostrum of the sphenoid, the nasal spine of the frontal bone, the inner aspect of the nasal bones, the crest of maxilla, and the crest of the palatine bone. I repeat again, what are the other bony contributions? The rostrum of the sphenoid, the inner aspect of the spine of the frontal bone, the inner aspect of the nasal bone, the crest of maxilla, and the crest of palatine bone. The spine of the frontal bone, it's a median process projecting down from the frontal bone and articulating with the two nasal bones, the spine of the frontal bone, wedging between the two nasal bones. The maxillary crest. The medial border of the palatine process of the maxilla is raised above into a ridge, and that is called the nasal crest of maxilla, which with the corresponding ridge of the opposite side forms a groove for the reception of the vomer. This is the rostrum of the sphenoid. This is the crest of maxilla. Now, the front part of this ridge raises to a considerable height and is named the incisor crest. It is prolonged forwards into a sharp process, which, together with a similar process of the opposite bone, forms the anterior nasal spine. Now, let us have a look. This is the cartilaginous part of the nasal septum. Behind the bony components, the perpendicular plate of ethmoid and vomer, and in front is the anterior nasal spine, the crest of maxilla, and the crest of the palatine bone. The medial border of the palatine process of the maxilla is raised above into a ridge, and that is called the nasal crest, which, with the corresponding ridge of the opposite side, forms a groove for the reception of the vomer. Now, the front part of this ridge raises to a considerable height and is named the incisor crest. It is prolonged forwards into a sharp process, the incisor crest prolonged forwards into a sharp process, which forms, together with a similar process of the opposite bone, the anterior nasal spine. This is the horizontal part of the palatine bone and the medial component of which forms the crest. This is the maxilla. This shows the crest of the palatine bone together with the opposite side forms a vertical ridge. The horizontal part of the palatine bone, the crest of the palatine bone. Let us have a look at a beautiful 3D photograph. This is the maxillary crest. Look at the maxillary crest. Look at the palatine process of the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. Look at a fantastic, beautiful cross section. This is the anterior nasal spine. That is the perpendicular plate of ethmoid and vomer. So beautiful it is. How this entire thing is configured. The two plates, the two components of the bony septum. The perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone is a thin, flat lamina, polygonal in form, descending from the undersurface of the cribriform plate, the perpendicular plate of ethmoid, and assists in forming the septum of the nose. It is generally deflected a little to one or the other side. Now, the anterior aspect of the ethmoid bone demonstrates the main part. In the midline is the laminae perpendicularis, or the perpendicular plate, extending upwards as the crista galli, and the lateral parts of this bone containing the concha as well as the ethmoidal cells, collectively called the ethmoidal labyrinth. Let us have a look at the various components. The quadrilateral septal cartilage, deriving its connections to the crest of maxilla, anteriorly to the inner aspect of the nasal bones, and in the midline it is wedged between the two medial crurae of the lower lateral cartilages. The bony components comprise of the perpendicular plate of ethmoid and vomer, and bony contributions include the rostrum of the sphenoid, the inner aspect of the spine of the frontal bone, the crest of the nasal bone, the crest of the maxilla, and the crest of the palatine bone. The vomer. The vomer is a thin, flat, sharp-shaped midline bone forming the dorsal part of the nasal septum. The ventral is above, the dorsal below. It is the only bone in the nasal septum that directly joins the nasal cavity's top and bottom surface. That is the vomer. Now, the vomer again is a thin, plough-shaped midline bone that occupies and divides the nasal cavity. It articulates inferiorly on the midline with the maxillae and the palatines, superiorly with the sphenoid via its wings, and anterosuperiorly with the ethmoids, the thin, flat vomer. That is the thin, flat vomer. Now, why is the vomer called the vomer? The thin, flat plate that ploughs the fields is called a vomer. And because this looks like this, it is also called, therefore, the vomer. This is a comprehensive overview of the nasal septum.